Welcome to a new episode of System Update. I'm Glenn Greenwald. This edition focuses on the U.S. relationship with China and specifically how U.S. policy planners and American citizens ought to think about China in terms of what the relationship should be between it and the United States. China has been a country that has received moderately more attention over the last decade, primarily because of its increasing power, both financial power and military power. For decades, China was a developing country mired in poverty and a lack of growth, but it has exploded with economic growth over the last several decades and now has become the second largest economy in the world after the United States. That economic growth has lifted millions and millions of Chinese citizens out of poverty, and it has also transformed China into a major military power, not just the second largest economy in the world, but also the second largest military in the world behind the United States. Now, even with China being the second largest military in the world, its military spending still pales in comparison to what the United States spends. The United States spends 5 times more, roughly, than China. The United States still spends more on its military than the next 7 countries combined, including countries with much larger populations, such as China and India. And even as a matter of GDP percentage, the United States spends 3.2% of its GDP on military spending, while China spends only 1.9%. But clearly, China has become a major military power. It has 300 nuclear weapons compared to roughly 6,000 or more that both the United States and Russia has. But the combination of this economic growth, this explosion of military spending, this lifting of its citizens out of poverty has caused China to exert its influence in its own region and throughout the world in a way that has made Americans pay far more attention to China and grapple with how we ought to think about it for the first time in a very long time. There has been a growing recognition in Washington about the importance of China and the need to think more clearly about it and pay more attention to it. When President Obama was elected in 2008, one of the first foreign policy proclamations that he issued was that he thought we were paying too much attention to the Middle East because of endless wars and obsession with Middle East oil, and insufficient attention to China and to Asia, and famously announced what he called the pivot to Asia, which was designed to counterbalance or counteract what he regarded and what Obama officials regarded as threatening Chinese influence that was on the rise, both in the region and globally. And it did lead to some moderate confrontation, some moderate increase of confrontation between the U.S. and China with things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that was designed to be a trade agreement with Asian countries that would exclude China and allow the United States to exert more influence in that region at China's expense. There were also clashes over things like democracy movements in Hong Kong, independence movements in Taiwan, as well as traditional Chinese conflict with countries like South Korea and Vietnam that the U.S. tried to exploit. But it was really only within the last several months, with the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic, did tensions really begin to become serious in terms of mainstream U.S. discourse. From the beginning of the pandemic, there has been a conflict in domestic U.S. politics about how to speak about China, about what role and blame to assign to China for the outbreak of the pandemic. One trivial and vapid, though symbolically important, debate became whether to call it the China virus or the Wuhan virus, as the Republicans were attempting to do, or simply to call it the coronavirus on the grounds that ascribing it to one country was xenophobic or racist or otherwise unnecessarily confrontational. And within those debates, one can see the seeds of potential confrontation and conflict growing between the two countries. That confrontation and potential for conflict significantly intensified with the rhetoric of certain Trump administration officials, particularly Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, long a hardcore war hawk within the Republican Party, And that rhetoric reached its highest point this week when Secretary of State Pompeo claimed, with no evidence presented, that the coronavirus was something manufactured in a Wuhan Chinese lab and released into the world, whether inadvertently or deliberately. He suggested it was inadvertent, but still claimed that the evidence was overwhelming now, that it was actually created in a Chinese lab, a very inflammatory claim to make. It was presented with no evidence. It had been something that intelligence officials had been anonymously claiming to media outlets, also with no evidence. And it was a claim that even U.S. allies instantly cast doubt upon by saying that there's simply no compelling evidence to believe that's the case. But the fact that Secretary of State Pompeo tried to pin the blame for this coronavirus that has caused untold suffering and death and misery and economic deprivation around the world on the Chinese government is indicative of the fact that there clearly are elements within the U.S. government intent on ratcheting up tensions between the U.S. and China, which makes it more necessary than ever to understand the realities versus the mythologies of the U.S.-Chinese relationship and to grapple with how we ought to be talking about it and how we ought to be thinking about it. That's particularly the case since it is now becoming commonplace within the hawkish elements of the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party and throughout the West to call for China to, quote, pay for what it did, whether that means handling the coronavirus negligently in its initial stages, suppressing information that could have helped the world better prepare, or even something more sinister like Secretary of State Pompeo suggested. But the attempt not only to pin the blame for the coronavirus on China, but to call for them to pay, which can be a vague invocation, meaning they ought to financially compensate the world for the losses that they caused, or that they ought to pay in terms of being isolated or sanctioned or even militarily punished. And the rhetoric in U.S. discourse toward China has never been more hawkish, has never been more confrontational, at least since the Cold War. China is actually a difficult country to think about in terms of the question of how it ought to be regarded, whether it should be considered what it clearly is, which is simply a competitor of the U.S. Government and the United States generally. Almost every country, including close European allies, are competitors of the United States in terms of competing for contracts and economic opportunity and even geopolitical influence with the United States. But the question that we really need to grapple with is whether China should be regarded, as many are suggesting, as an adversary or even an enemy of the United States. And the reason that that is not an easy question to answer, the reason that it doesn't allow for pat and dogmatic answers, that it eludes those kinds of long-standing frameworks, is that China doesn't really fall into any of the classic models for how various ideological factions in the United States talk about competitors and adversaries of the United States, or how various ideologies guide us to think about what the United States approach should be. So if you think about it in very broad terms, and there's a lot of overlap between these categories, one can sort of define 5 or 6 different ideological camps in the United States that have consistent, long-standing approaches for how other countries should be thought about when they become competitors to or even adversaries of the United States. You have right-wing war hawks of the variety of, say, what John McCain was, what Marco Rubio is, what Lindsey Graham is. Going back to the Reagan administration, the classic right-wing hawkish line that says if there's a country that is in any way threatening the United States, not necessarily militarily, but in terms of vital U.S. interests, we ought to be aggressive towards them, we ought to confront them, we ought to threaten them, and if necessary, we ought to even be willing to have a military conflict with them. Going back to the Reagan era, it was the motto of peace through strength, or Bill Kristol's famous formulation that weakness is provocative. And we're seeing some elements of the Republican Party and even the Democratic Party that are hawkish trying to embrace and shove China into that model. Tom Cotton and Marco Rubio and people like that saying China must pay in very threatening terms. Then you have the neoconservative camp that, although is certainly has a lot of overlap with this right-wing hawkishness, tends to phrase and frame its argument differently, which is that the U.S. has an interest in exporting democracy and overthrowing regimes that are highly repressive, because doing so serves U.S. interests. It's certainly not consistently or even genuinely applied. Neocons love very repressive regimes that are favorable to U.S. interests, like in Saudi Arabia or Egypt. But the packaging, the pretext, is that when a country becomes sufficiently repressive, as they now argue China is, it's necessary for the U.S. to subvert that regime or to even overthrow it. Then you have the neoliberal or humanitarian interventionist camp that says that when a country is repressive, it is the moral duty of the United States to intervene using our diplomatic force, our economic strength, and even our military might in order to protect people's human rights from being abused. This was what led, or at least was the rationale and the pretext that led to things like overthrowing the regime in Libya and even going to war in Iraq, which a lot of people forget was sometimes justified on the grounds of this kind of right-wing hawkishness that Saddam Hussein was a direct threat to the United States, but in much of the case was a humanitarian interventionist case claiming that Saddam was repressive to the Kurds and to other citizens of Iraq, and therefore it was necessary to protect them to act morally. That was Tony Blair's primary argument, this kind of neoliberal humanitarian interventionist argument that says when a country is sufficiently repressive, it's not just our right, but our moral duty to confront that government, to subvert it, to weaken it, and even to overthrow it. Some of the most prominent advocates of that position are people like Samantha Power, Susan Rice, people who exerted extreme amounts of influence in the Obama administration and likely are to exert influence if Joe Biden wins again. Then there's what we can call the realist camp, which I would group in with paleoconservatives, which holds that we don't really care if a country is repressive as long as we can get along with that country. That's really none of our business. And that's what has led to the decades-long partnership with the most repressive and most brutal and savage dictatorships in the world, like the one in Saudi Arabia, like the one in Egypt, like the Gulf states. A philosophy or an ideology that says it's really not U.S. concern or the business of the United States if a country is even radically repressive to its people. And I think with some exceptions, you could put, for example, President Obama into that camp, which is why he often was in conflict with some of his more hawkish advisors and the hawkish elements of the Democratic Party. And then you have the anti-imperialist left, which can often find common ground with the isolationist right. There are obviously differences between the two camps, but the similarity that they share is one that says that in cases where there's a country that is being depicted as a U.S. adversary or a U.S. enemy, as China in some cases is being depicted, the necessary response is to resist any effort to ratchet up tensions, that the only legitimate use of military force or even confrontation is one where another country is directly threatening or otherwise attacking the United States. Otherwise, it's our moral duty to ensure that the U.S. is not able to lay the groundwork for heightened tension with another country. And that would certainly be the case for China. The idea is that China is the new U.S. enemy. There are camps within the United States that want to escalate the rhetorical confrontation, the financial confrontation, and even the military confrontation with China. And therefore, our only response should be to resist that, to say that China, the threat of China is being exaggerated. The model that I've always tried to use since I began writing about politics in 2005 is very similar to the last one, and it's one of the reasons why I'm grappling with this question of China, because it doesn't really fit. China doesn't really fit well into any of those models, including the one I've traditionally used. The model I've traditionally used in thinking about foreign policy is one that holds that when there's a repressive regime in the world, whether it be the United States, which has done all sorts of repressive acts over the last several decades, or a close U.S. ally, a country that receives diplomatic or economic or military aid from the United States, such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Israel and NATO, it's not just our right, but our duty to denounce that repression, that aggression, that violence, and to oppose it because we bear direct responsibility for it. But when it comes to countries that the U.S. is not supporting or propping up or enabling or empowering, it doesn't really make much sense to focus much on the repression of those governments, because the only thing that we actually end up doing is not ending the repression in those countries. It's ratcheting up tensions between the United States and those countries and making confrontation and war more likely. And the most vivid example that I can think of to highlight the reason I believe this rationale makes sense was, I recall very shortly after I began writing about politics in 2005, in 2006, 2007, after the United States had stabilized its force in Iraq. Obviously, the Iraq War was not stable, but there was a stable presence, military presence in Iraq that wasn't going anywhere. Neocons began making clear, the war planners of that invasion began making clear that their intention all along, and still, was to topple the regime in Tehran. There was a famous, iconic, anonymous quote from a neocon who was almost certainly somebody like Richard Pearl or David Frum or Paul Wolfowitz or Douglas Feith, that said that it's easy to go to Baghdad, real men go to Tehran. And they were clearly agitating for a U.S. regime change war with Iran, modeled after the one that had just been executed in Iraq. And in order to justify that, in order to fuel the flames of hostility in the United States towards Iran, neocons began using media outlets to, for the first time, hype the abusive treatment of LGBTs, particularly gay men, in Iran. We suddenly got deluged with stories about gay men hanging from cranes, about gay men being thrown off roofs as the death penalty by the Iranian government. And we were supposed to believe that this concern was genuine, that the same people who had come into power and who had fortified their power in the United States through anti-gay referendum, through trying to amend the Constitution to ban gay marriage, to stimulate all kinds of animosity towards LGBTs, who were in bed with regimes that treated LGBTs at least as brutally and savagely as Iran, if not worse, such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt, were suddenly so concerned about the state of LGBTs in Iran and the abuse by the Iranian government of LGBTs. Now, obviously, I find any kind of abuse of LGBTs, particularly hanging them from cranes or throwing them off roofs or imposing the death penalty on them, to be morally reprehensible. But there was no good reason for me to spend my time and energy denouncing the state of LGBTs in Iran, because I didn't have the potential, I didn't have the influence, I didn't have the possibility or the potential to change that. I don't speak Farsi. I don't have any kind of base in Iran. I don't have a follower, a readership. I don't have a readership in Iran. There was nothing that I could do by denouncing the treatment of LGBTs by the Iranian government to actually put an end to that injustice. If I did it, it might make me feel good about myself. It might make me feel like I'm a person who is noble and benevolent and cares about human rights, but I didn't have any power to actually influence repression in Iran. The only thing that my writing about and speaking about those abuses would have done, the only actual outcome that would have resulted, is helping neocons increase the amount of hostility towards the government of Iran in the United States in order to make the war that they craved more likely. That's what they always do when they want war with another country, not just neocons, but warmongers in the U.S. Generally, they suddenly decide that regimes that they've long supported, such as Saddam Hussein's, are now human rights abusers. So when it comes time to go to war with them in the Persian Gulf, we suddenly hear about Saddam ripping babies out of incubators, which was a made-up story, but it was designed to make us angry and feel so hateful towards Saddam that we were willing to support a war. That was the point of this deluge of stories about LGBTs in Iran. And so my posture always has been, I'm not going to aid efforts by hawks and warmongers in the U.S. by talking about the human rights abuses of U.S. enemies, because it doesn't help end those injustices. It only helps increase confrontation. But I will talk about the injustices of my own government and those governments supported by the United States, using whatever means are paid for through tax dollars and other weapons and instruments that the United States government has. Probably the most iconic quote encapsulating this philosophy about how to think of other countries comes from Noam Chomsky, who wrote, quote, "My own concern is primarily the terror and violence carried out by my own state. for two reasons. For one thing, because it happens to be the larger component of international violence, but also for a much more important reason than that. Namely, I can do something about it. So even if the US was responsible for 2% of the violence in the world instead of the majority of it, it would be that 2% I would be primarily responsible for. And that is a simple ethical judgment. That is, the ethical value of one's actions depends on their anticipated and predictable consequences. It is very easy to denounce the atrocities of someone else, but that has about as much ethical value as denouncing atrocities that took place in the 18th century. So then the question becomes, how do we think about China based on which model of foreign policy and which ideological perspective we've chosen to embrace as a means of thinking about other countries? Does China fit easily into any of those models? And I don't think it does. And that's why I think it's so important to grapple more deeply and in a more complex way with the question of how we ought to think about China than mainstream US discourse has thus far done. There's no question that China is repressive. It explicitly opposes Western conceptions of free speech and free press for its own citizens. It controls the media with an iron fist. It punishes dissidents. It specifically and aggressively suppresses any information that is contrary to Chinese interests from being disseminated within China or through its media outlets, as we saw at the outbreak of the coronavirus.
Would the WHO consider Taiwan's membership? Hello?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I couldn't hear your question.
Okay, yeah. Let me repeat the question.
No, that's okay. Let's move to another one then.
Right, because I'm actually curious on talking about Taiwan as well, on Taiwan's case.
Probably the most egregious human rights abuse is the detention of up to 1 million ethnic Uyghurs who are Muslims, who are citizens of China and live in China, but are regarded as despised minorities and a danger to the civic stability of China, and their treatment has become increasingly abusive over the years. So there's no question that China is repressive. But there's also no question that China is no more repressive than many of the closest allies of the United States, the ones I mentioned earlier, such as Saudi Arabia, which carved up after it brutally executed Jamal Khashoggi in the Turkish embassy in Istanbul, or Egypt, which also suppresses any kind of dissent, kills any kinds of political opponents of the military regime that took over anti-democratically. Israel, which has occupied Palestine brutally and illegally, according to the UN, for decades, and many other US allies, both over the decades and now, that are at least as repressive as China. So simply observing that China is repressive doesn't get us very far. It also doesn't get us very far even to focus on the treatment of ethnic Uyghurs, Muslims inside China, because the United States' treatment of Muslims over the past 2 decades has been as bad, if not worse. It's very difficult to view as anything other than cynical and pretextual the concern by people who seek added increased confrontation with China over their treatment of Muslims, given that the United States has spent the last 20 years now bombing 8 separate predominantly Muslim countries, has invaded several of them, has subverted the governments of many, has imposed dictatorships on many others, implemented programs of torture aimed almost exclusively at Muslims, rendition, kidnapping them off the streets of European cities and shipping them to very brutal allied regimes, including in Damascus and Cairo, in order to be tortured and interrogated, and still to this very day maintaining a gulag in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean called Guantanamo, where dozens of people continue to be held for 20 years without due process. So when it comes to repression, yes, China is repressive, so is the United States, and so are many of its closest allies. So simply to talk about Chinese repression doesn't tell us very much about how we ought to think about China, since the United States is close allies with some of the most brutal and repressive regimes on the planet, and itself uses highly savage and repressive means to advance its own interests. The other complicating factor with the debate over how to think about China is that while it is true that there are certain sectors of the US body politic, the hardcore right-wing warmongers, the xenophobes, the hardened anti-communist dogmatists who clearly seek more tension, more conflict, even more confrontation with China. There are numerous power centers, very important and influential power centers, that think about China in exactly the opposite way. They love the Chinese Communist Party and the government of China because their profits and their prosperity depend on positive relations with it. And that, to me, is what really distinguishes China from traditional U.S. adversaries or countries that the United States government and its media have tried to depict as Chinese enemies, which is, in the past, typically, whoever is being depicted as the latest U.S. enemy with whom we have to go to war, whom we have to confront more aggressively, there's a unity in terms of demonizing and villainizing and otherizing them when it comes to U.S. power centers. There were no oligarchs standing up in 2002 and praising Saddam Hussein. There were no captains of industry in 2007 and 2008 or now standing up and defending the Iranian mullahs, or even Vladimir Putin in Russia or Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. There's no real division. There's no real fracture among U.S. power centers when it comes to how it treats its standard classic U.S. enemies. That was certainly true of the Soviet Union throughout the entire Cold War. China is much different. There are very powerful people who defend China very aggressively and who regard it as not just a friend, an ally, but a critical, vital, indispensable ally. We see this even in the division between how President Trump talks about China and how many of his Republican colleagues or even officials in his cabinet do. While people like Mike Pompeo and Tom Cotton and Marco Rubio call for increased confrontation with China, President Trump, since his inauguration, has done very little other than heap praise on President Xi. Even when there was repression of the democracy movements in Hong Kong, Trump seemed to side with the Chinese government. Even at the outbreak of the coronavirus, President Trump repeatedly heaped praise on how the Chinese treated and handled and managed the outbreak of the pandemic, denying claims that the Chinese suppressed information and otherwise heralding the good job China had done. Yes, he did seek to call it the Wuhan virus, or the China virus, in order to separate blame for himself and pin it on somebody else, looking at his reelection. But Trump's rhetoric over the last 4 years has been very favorable to Beijing, heralding President Xi as a close friend of his, talking about their great relationship, and talking about China as a very well-managed and well-run country. Universes away from the suggestion that there's a movement to turn China into an enemy with whom the U.S. seeks military confrontation. Again, there are important sectors that do want to do that, but President Trump himself has typically not been on board. More importantly, arguably, than President Trump are the U.S. oligarchs and what you might want to call the Davos crowd, which are in bed with China in all kinds of critical ways. They're inextricably linked, and that's the reason why you see the richest and most powerful oligarchs routinely and openly and aggressively defending the Chinese government. One of the most important examples is Michael Bloomberg, who, even when he was running for president, refused to criticize the Chinese government, even as he was attacking Bernie Sanders for supposedly supporting repressive communist regimes in Cuba and Nicaragua and elsewhere. When Michael Bloomberg was asked overtly whether he regarded China as a dictatorship, he said he didn't, because the Chinese people were content and happy with the government and didn't want the freedoms, the Western-style freedoms, that the Chinese government denies it. At the outbreak of the coronavirus, one of the most vocal defenders of China's handling of the pandemic was not just President Trump, but Bill Gates, who has long been a defender of China's role in international relations and international affairs. And if you go to Davos, or if you look at the management objectives of multinational corporations and international capital, they regard China not as an enemy, not as an adversary, not even as a competitor, but as a very close friend on whom their ongoing and future profits depend. Perhaps the most interesting and illustrative example is the consulting giant McKinsey, which has become a symbol of sociopathic capitalism for many in the United States because of their unfettered advice and consultancy to U.S. corporations to strip jobs away from the United States, to simply have a single-minded focus on maximizing profit margins without regard to the effect that it has on the lives of hundreds of millions of people. There was a New York Times article in late December of 2018 that was reporting on the decision by McKinsey to hold its annual retreat in China. And it discussed the key role that McKinsey plays in advising U.S. corporations to move closer to Beijing, as McKinsey itself moves closer to Beijing because of how central it is to their profit margins. And that article read, quote, "For a quarter century, the company has joined many American corporations in helping stoke China's transition from an economic laggard to the world's second largest economy. But as China's growth presents a muscular challenge to American dominance, Washington has become increasingly critical of some of Beijing's signature policies, including the ones McKinsey has helped advance. One of McKinsey's state-owned clients has even helped China's artificial islands in the South China Sea, a major point of military tension with the United States." So what you see is not the unity that we often see, we typically see among power centers when it comes to thinking about U.S. adversaries. We see a very wide division, a huge breach, a cleavage between how certain sectors of the U.S. political apparatus think about China and seek increased confrontation with it versus how the United States' most influential and powerful financial actors who control and fund and own both political parties think about China. They are wildly different. Beyond that division, what makes China so distinct in contrast to how we think about other countries that have taken center stage as U.S. enemy or U.S. adversary that justifies huge military budgets or even war, is that the relationship between U.S. industry and the U.S. government with China has profound and serious and deleterious effects on the United States and on the West and on particularly the working class in these countries. Because of the lack of wage protection and the lack of labor protection in China, it is in the interest, as McKinsey advises its clients, for U.S. corporations to remove its factories, to remove its manufacturing activities from the United States, where they have to confront unions, where they have to confront minimum wage, where they have to confront labor protections, and move it to China, where they can exploit a form of slave labor. That is just the reality. And if you are somebody who wants to talk about the devastation in the industrial Midwest of shuttered factories and job loss because of free trade organizations and free trade agreements like NAFTA and the World Trade Organization, it is impossible to talk about China in these simplistic terms of simply saying China should be our friend, China is a positive influence on the world, because China is a major reason why there has been so much job loss in the United States, why wages have been plummeting, why the standard of living for American workers has declined. And that is something that one needs to grapple with. It doesn't mean that we should think about China as being sinister. China is simply advancing its own interests, but it does require us to think about U.S. policy toward China with respect to its own workers, with respect to standard of living for the working class and wages inside the United States. It was long a left-wing cause to rally against, to agitate and protest against international trade agreements because of the way in which they were destroying U.S. jobs. That was what the protests in Seattle that turned violent against the World Trade Organization were all about. And it's now left to a small pocket of populists, both on the left and the right, to elevate that cause. There was just an op-ed in the New York Times this week by the right-wing populist senator from Missouri, Josh Hawley, arguing for the elimination, the abolition of the World Trade Organization on the grounds that it has served Chinese interests at the expense of the American worker, once a fairly common view on the left. So it is not sufficient to simply shove China into the same framework as Venezuela or Iran or North Korea or Russia when it comes to resisting efforts to depict China as an adversary or as an enemy. It is far more complex than that for all of the reasons I've cited. And so to help me grapple with how to think about this question, because I still am unclear about exactly what to think about how we should think about China, and hopefully to help you do so as well, I have two guests who have become specialists in the relationship between China and the United States. The first is Kishore Mahbubani, who is a longtime diplomat with Singapore. He was the permanent representative of Singapore to the United Nations, served briefly as the president of the UN Security Council. He has since become a scholar with the China Institute and has written a book out just a few weeks ago entitled Has China Won? The Chinese Challenge to American Primacy. And his argument is that we are overstating the dangers of the competition posed by China to the United States, that there's no reason for Americans to regard China in a hostile or threatening manner. And my other guest, who also has developed a specialty on this question, has a different perspective. He's Matt Stoller, who has served in many positions both in Congress and in Washington think tanks, and is currently a researcher at the American Economic Liberties Project and the author of a 2019 book entitled Goliath, The 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy, that explores many of these questions of how U.S. corporate power is in bed with the Chinese government and bringing a form of economic authoritarianism to capitalism, who argues that we are thinking insufficiently about China, that it is truly a threat, both in terms of the impact it has for the ability of the working class in the United States and the West to maintain a decent standard of living and jobs and wages, but also to our core civil liberties, that China is intent on using its economic power to constrict liberties in the United States. So listening to both of these analysts, I think, provides a very deep and I hope thought-provoking scope for what this debate is and ought to be. I hope you enjoy the show. Joining me now to explore the complexities of the U.S.-China relationship is one of the world's great specialists in this topic. He is a longtime Singaporean scholar and diplomat, holding many diplomatic positions, including Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations. And what really prompted my attention and my desire to speak with him about these issues is his new book, just out within the last several weeks, that is, for me, the definitive account of U.S. and China relationship, entitled Has China Won? The Chinese Challenge to American Primacy. Kishore Mahbubani, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
So I want to begin by asking you about the current debate in the United States about how to think about China. There are a lot of people who are thinking about this question deeply for the first time, obviously because of the relationship of China to the coronavirus pandemic. And I don't think it's controversial to say for anybody that China is a competitor of the United States. That's a pretty light label to put on another country. They certainly are competitors in terms of trade and business and probably even foreign affairs. That's true of a lot of countries, including ones with whom the U.S. is allied. But a much more difficult question is whether to regard China as an adversary or even an enemy, geostrategically, politically, and militarily. How do you think U.S. policymakers and U.S. citizens ought to regard China in terms of that question?
Well, I must say that's a great question, and I'm glad that you made an important conceptual distinction between a competitor and an enemy. Because quite often people combine the two into one, and they're two very, very different things. So there is absolutely no doubt that China will be a formidable competitor for the United States in many dimensions. And so, the United States, partly because, I guess, of an accident of history, especially since World War II, at the end of World War II, it had almost 50% of the global GNP. At one time, we were spending more on defense than the rest of the world combined. So the United States enjoyed a position of relative power that was amazing, probably far greater even than the Roman Empire. So the United States got used to enjoying that much geopolitical space. But actually, that amount of geopolitical space was artificial. China and India, which used to have the largest economies for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, had to severely underperform for United States to have such a dominant share of the world economy. But now they're just naturally coming back, and so the United States share is naturally shrinking, and so we are just returning to a normal world where the United States will have competitors as strong as it. But the most important question is China an enemy or a threat? And I am actually very frightened how so many members of the American establishment have sort of locked themselves into a position of saying, China is obviously a threat, China is obviously an enemy, without trying to deconstruct the meaning of the phrase. What does enemy mean? What does threat mean? For example, does China have any intention at all of conquering the United States? 0%. I mean, the United States has got 6,000 nuclear weapons and China has 300. I mean, folly for China to attack the United States in any way. And I think that the lack of strategic thinking in the United States on this subject is actually frightening. And the man actually who gave me this insight, surprisingly, was Henry Kissinger when I had a one-on-one lunch with him in New York in March 2018. And I got his permission to cite him as saying that the United States has made a major geopolitical mistake by launching this incredible geopolitical competition with China without first working out a clear long-term strategy. And the goal of my book is to help the United States by saying the first step before you launch a geopolitical contest, Sun Tzu said, know thyself, know thine enemy. The United States is not aware of its own strategic weaknesses, and the United States is not aware of the great strategic strength of China. So that's what my book tries to do, give a more balanced picture and say, look at the overall picture before you plunge into this contest.
Right. So just to try and do what you suggested that Americans ought to do, which is deconstruct the debate and the premises on which it's now situated, I don't think that the most rational or compelling case that people make when they want to depict China as an adversary or even an enemy is that China may conquer the U.S. militarily for the reasons that you said. I think part of it is what you alluded to at the beginning of your answer, which is the fact that the U.S. has been the hegemonic power for so long. And so any country that seems to be competing with it even is almost viewed as threatening for a country that, at least for a couple of decades, have been trained to believe that it enjoys unfettered hegemonic power. But the more important question, I think, in terms of whether Americans will regard China as a kind of friendly competitor or something more sinister, something more menacing, is the following. And I'm really interested in your perspective on this question, which is, I think by and large, Americans have accepted a principle after World War II, and obviously with lots of deviations and aberrations, and by no means universal, but a kind of core principle when thinking about other countries, that if another country is internally repressive, it's not threatening to the United States as long as they're content to maintain that repression within their own borders. But when they start to formulate a project, a mission of exporting that form of governance to other countries, that's when it becomes threatening. And so I'm really interested in your view on whether the Chinese Communist Party, the ruling government in China, in your view, has as one of its goals, whether out of some sense of strategic self-defense or something more offensive, more aggressive, to export its governing ideology, not using superior military force, but using superior economic power?
Well, I very good questions, but actually many questions, and I'll try to answer them one by one. First, let me emphasize the most important thing. When you use the phrase United States enjoys hegemonic power in the world, and I guess what you're referring to is American primacy in the international order. And I think I would like to urge Americans to think very hard about what is more important for America, defending America's primacy or defending America's people. Because the interests of the two actually are quite different. People think it's the same, but it's not the same. But the second point I want to make is that unlike the Soviet Union, which had a competing ideology, and Khrushchev kept on saying, our system is better than yours, we will defeat you, we'll become better than you, we'll become stronger than you. You notice that Chinese actually never boast about their system. The Chinese do not believe that their system is good for America or even good for the rest of the world. The Chinese believe that their system is good for China. And they believe that that's what they need. And after the century of humiliation, when they were beaten up, trampled upon, the one lesson they learned is that if China is not strong, countries will take advantage of China. They just want China to be strong. But that doesn't mean that they have any desire to step into the shoes of the US in all its hegemonic roles overseas. And to give you a concrete example, one of the areas, as you know, as I discuss in my book, the United States has wasted trillions of dollars. I'm not exaggerating, trillions of dollars fighting wars in the Middle East. And, you know, the United States thinks that, gosh, if we don't do that, China is going to take over the region. And if I can give you a big secret, China is very happy that the United States is spending trillions of dollars fighting wars in the Middle East. In fact, the Iraq war was a geopolitical gift to China. The Chinese wondering why the Americans are shooting themselves in the foot, but they say, if they want to shoot themselves in the foot, go ahead, we will not stop them. And the Chinese have absolutely no desire to play the same kind of global leadership role that the United States has played, because the priority of the Chinese government, and this is why the Chinese government in many ways is strategically more focused, because it is focused on improving the well-being of its own people, it is 1.4 billion people, and they want to make sure that China reaches the level of the developed, advanced countries. And all they want is an external environment that is conducive for China to grow, so it doesn't have adversaries, enemies. And so it has, by the way, a very patient, careful, long-term strategy of creating a geostrategic environment around it that enables it to grow. But it has no desire to try and step in and take over the kind of global responsibilities that the United States is doing. And frankly, at the end of the day, if the United States wanted to be strategically smart, what it should do is, as Mao would say, focus on the primary contradiction today, which is, of course, the competition with China. And to focus on the primary contradiction, the first thing you have to do is improve your internal strength, which is what George Kennan emphasized, and stop fighting wars in the Middle East. I mean, these are the sort of things I'm advising the United States to do, which are actually in the interests of the United States. I'm not anti-American. I'm actually saying, hey, guys, you just taken on the biggest geopolitical contest ever, and you're not even thinking through what this means, you know? This actually is a formidable enterprise the US has taken on. And I'm saying, okay, you decided, now let's go through what it means for you in real terms.
So I think, I think that's a message that will resonate and is resonating for a lot of Americans. The idea that this role that you are clinging to and are fearful that China wants to replace you as being, even though they don't, is actually not very good for you. It's not really in your interest. And I think there's a growing, you can call it anti-war, anti-imperialist, isolationist sentiment that Donald Trump in 2016 rhetorically exploited because of this growing recognition that why are we undertaking this massive burden of trying to rule the world in a way that is actually contrary to our own interests. But I think that what people who want to depict China as sinister and as menacing and as threatening are doing effectively is they're using examples, and you talk about some of them in your book, but I'll talk about a recent one that actually took place right as your book was coming out or right after, which was the now notorious incident where an official with the NBA made a very kind of banal comment in defense of or in support of the protesters in Hong Kong. And the Chinese government made very clear that the NBA could lose all kinds of contracts, and generally outspoken basketball stars, when asked about it, clammed up and seemed to be petrified of saying a negative word. And the same thing happened with the director general or an official with the World Health Organization when asked about Taiwan, and he pretended that he couldn't hear the question and disconnected the Skype call. That the Chinese are using their economic influence, their economic power, not necessarily for conquest, but to limit and constrict free discourse in a way that makes Americans who value those liberties concerned that growing Chinese power can begin to constrict them. Is there validity to that concern?
Yes, good, very good questions. And I'm going to give you a two-part answer. Because they're linked. Earlier on, you used the word repressive, right? And you said America is afraid of a repressive China. And so the impression that Americans have, many people have, is that the only way that the Chinese government is holding on to power in China is through really sitting on its people, using its brutal totalitarian power and keeping the people down. And one of the most shocking things I sometimes say to any Western audience is, I said, I want you to know, and this is a fact, that the majority of the 1.2 billion people in China support the Chinese, 1.4 billion people support the Chinese government. And if they didn't, the Chinese government would be toast. There's no way any country can keep down 1.4 billion people. And unlike the Soviet Union, and I went to Moscow in 1976, where you could really feel you were in a dark, oppressive place in Moscow, where you look around the show, you worry what's going to happen, it was dark and drab. If you go to China today, and I first went to China in 1980, where people couldn't choose what to wear, where to live, what to work, where to study. Now they can choose where to live, what to wear, where to study. And amazingly, I must emphasize this, 130 million Chinese. 130 million Chinese leave China freely every year. And then they go back every year freely to China. So China, it is, by the way, and I want to emphasize this too, yes, in some ways, China is a repressive society. It doesn't allow the kind of free speech that the United States does. It doesn't allow political parties. That's true. But it's not a black and white thing. The Chinese people today, in relative terms, are enjoying more freedom than they have enjoyed for a long time. And that's why the Chinese government enjoys lots of support. Now, the second question is the Chinese government using its powers to repress free speech elsewhere? And my answer to that is that China is a normal great power. All great powers will use their influence to get their way. It is regardless of whether you're democratic or non-democratic, that's irrelevant. What you try to do is, if you believe that your interests are affected, you will react strongly. And I think it's also important to remember that the reason why the Chinese get somewhat hot under the collar on Hong Kong is that it is a symbol of the beginning of the century of humiliation that they suffered in 1842, where the British forced them to accept opium in return for Chinese tea, and then also took Hong Kong and put it in their pocket. So these are all symbols of what they suffered in the past. And if people come along and if the West says, oh, we care so deeply for the people of Hong Kong, you do? Why didn't the British give democracy to Hong Kong in 150 years of British rule? The obvious question, right? Why didn't they? So, and so there's a history behind all this. And just to illustrate what a normal great power does, one of the poorest countries in the world in the 70s was probably Ethiopia. Bono launched a concert for it and so on and so forth. Now, Ethiopia, I think this is a story from Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner, right? Mm-hmm. Ethiopia borrowed some loans from private banks in America to buy aircraft. They have a good airline actually, but the interest rates were high, so they paid off the loans early to avoid paying high interest rates to American banks. The American banks got very angry. They called the U.S. Treasury. The U.S. Treasury called the World Bank, and the World Bank cut off loans to Ethiopia, a poor country, because Ethiopia did the right thing in paying off loans early. I just tell this story that all great powers will use their power to defend their interests. And as China becomes stronger and greater, China will also use its powers to defend its interests.
So just on that point, you said that China's interest is doing what is best for its people, which is, one hopes, the goal of most healthy governments. And it's certainly true from everything that I can see that as is true in Russia, the government of China enjoys the support of a huge number of people. I nonetheless would be remiss if I didn't ask you about some of the maximalist claims about human rights abuses, not because I want to suggest that China is somehow unique or inflame tensions on the part of the United States, because oftentimes human rights abuses are used propagandistically in that way. I mean, obviously, the U.S. government is fine with human rights abuses. Some of their closest allies, like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, are some of the worst human rights violators on the planet, and that's always been the case. But I want to ask you, because it is on people's mind, and I think it's an important opportunity for people to hear an informed and kind of neutral perspective. People say that it's one thing for there to be repression, not to afford free speech in the same way that the West does. That people can live with. But things like putting 1 million Uyghurs in what are being called concentration camps, or punishing doctors in Wuhan who tried to alert the world to the dangers of the coronavirus, those go far beyond what we ought to, as a kind of international community, tolerate. And so my question to you is, are those claims about human rights abuses in China, notwithstanding the fact that a majority of the people support the government, but the minority of people who are being subjected to these human rights abuses, are those claims exaggerated, or are they pretty accurate in terms of the reflection of what China is willing to do to some of its minorities or dissidents?
Very, very good questions. And I want to begin by emphasizing that I believe that we should support and strengthen human rights, okay? I've never had my fingernails pulled, okay? Never, fortunately. But I don't want to live in any society where my fingernails get pulled and where there's torture and so on and so forth. So I think we all share certain common desires to improve human rights. And I would say certainly in the case of China, it's also in China's interest to try and improve its human rights record. But my answer to you is that I want to use one figure, if you don't mind, that every American should be aware of. And I call it the 6 billion figure. What is the 6 billion figure? The 6 billion figure refers to the 6 billion people who live outside the United States and China. 330 million in America, 1.4 billion in China. There are 6 billion people outside. And I want to emphasize that these 6 billion people, the vast majority of them, have become very well informed, and especially the elites have become very sophisticated, very nuanced in their understanding of human rights issues, and who's doing what, who's doing right, and who's doing wrong, okay? And what the 6 billion people do not buy is this American perspective. And, I have a chapter about that.
Right.
That America is very virtuous and China is evil. That kind of black and white perspective doesn't cut ice anymore, because the first modern developed country to reintroduce torture, to the shock of many people, including the shock of the United States, as you know, in Guantanamo and elsewhere. So people can see that. And it's interesting that you mentioned Uyghurs, because as you know, I discussed that in my book. And what is puzzling about what's happening in Uyghurs, that many in the West don't see this, is that Here you have a group of Western countries who all came together to table a resolution in the United Nations to protest against the treatment of Muslims in China. And what was shocking is that the West couldn't get a single Muslim country to support it. And by contrast, a large number of Muslim countries actually sided with China and said, we understand what China is doing, is trying to impose law and order in its countries, and we don't see anything special. And I think the West should have listened very carefully to that, because frankly, as I say in my book, I live, Singapore is surrounded by more Muslims than Israel is, by the way. Just so that you understand, I live in an Islamic world. And the Islamic world is going through a major transformation. It is struggling to modernize, to come to terms with the modern world, to figure out the right balance between its religious obligations and the secular world. And each of them, Bangladesh, Indonesia, all are struggling, right? And what the West can do, if it wants to help the Islamic world, it should do two things. One, stop bombing Islamic countries. Even President Obama, peaceful man, dropped 26,000 bombs on 7 countries in 1 year. You mean bombing Islamic countries is the solution? And I say that because the Muslims see all this bombing, and then they say, oh, China is doing something wrong. So, that's what I mean. Please don't introduce black and white perspectives on these issues. And I think we should try to help the Uyghurs, and I think we should try and help them modernize. And from the Chinese point of view, what they're saying is that we had our 9/11 moment, you had your 9/11 moment, you attacked Afghanistan, you attacked Iraq. And as you know, they had their 9/11 moment, they had various terrorist attacks in Chinese cities. And what they're trying to do is to de-radicalize Uyghur society. So let's wait and see 5 years, 10 years from now, what happens in Xinjiang. And I think it's important for the West then to compare what it did in Iraq, what it did in Syria, what it did in Libya, and then compare it with Xinjiang. And say these are the relevant benchmarks that you would use. And that's why you realize, and I would say also to people in the West who raise the Uyghur issue, can you please try to persuade some fellow Muslims to join you in saying this is wrong, instead of making this a Western cause against China.
Right. Yeah, it's a little odd, and not just odd, but ultimately ineffective for a country that has, as you said, invaded and bombed multiple predominantly Muslim countries for several decades, but 2 decades for now, that supports Israel in every conceivable way against the Palestinians, that still has a gulag in the middle of the ocean where people are imprisoned for going on 20 years with no charges, to use a concern for Muslims as a kind of battering ram against China. I do think you're right that people have found their way through that propaganda. Let me ask you as my last question, and I really want to encourage people to read your book, to think carefully about how it talks about China, because I do think that there's a tendency in U.S. discourse, especially with this pandemic, where tensions and anxiety are so high and therefore easily exploitable, to fall into that good versus evil trap that has proven so dangerous so many times. But if you set aside that who's good and who's bad question that we've been discussing, who's a threat, who's not a threat, who wants peace, who doesn't, there is a domestic concern in the United States on the part of a lot of people, both on the left and the right now, that says something along the lines of, as long as China can continue to attract U.S. corporations or multinational corporations because they don't really have any labor protections, they allow people to work very long hours for very little pay with very little worker rights, China will always be a threat to the American worker. And it already is, because so many American jobs have left and have gone to China. Yes, also other Asian places. There's also other Asian countries. There's also automation that has caused the loss of American jobs. But is that a legitimate concern for people in the United States to say, look, it's not that I consider China to be evil or even a threat, but I do believe that we need to figure out a way to minimize China's ability to attract jobs, because the Davos crowd loves China because they know if they move their factories there, their profit margins will increase. How do you suggest that people who are trying to work their way through that problem think about the relationship with China?
First, let me just make two quick lines and I'll respond directly to the question on workers. There are two quick important messages for any American audience. Number one, I say, please do not demonize China. China is not evil. Don't demonize China, because then you don't understand China. Second, remember that China is the world's oldest civilization. And actually, the rest of the world treats China with a lot of respect because of its long civilization. Just remember that too. And as George Kennan said, don't insult your adversaries. But it is also true that when China, paradoxically, at the invitation of the United States, joined the World Trade Organization, that would obviously result in what Western economic theory, what Joseph Schumpeter taught us, there will be creative destruction. And that capitalism always has creative destruction. So when you introduce 800 million new workers into the global capitalist system, there had to be creative destruction. Some jobs had to be lost. By the way, jobs were lost in Singapore too, because we couldn't compete with China also. So we had to move up the value-added chain. And so and I think here, many people blame China for the loss of the jobs. But there's a two-part story, because in countries like Germany, Singapore, Sweden, and other places, they understood and anticipated that this creative destruction was coming. And we pumped a lot of money, a lot of resources into retraining workers and preparing them for a new economy. And that's what all countries have to do in response to this new competition. And I think the fundamentals of economic theory haven't changed. Ricardo's law of comparative advantage still holds true to any country that tries to manufacture everything itself, like North Korea, goes down. Any country that opens up and trades with the world enormously, like South Korea, goes up. So the world has essentially the North Korea and South Korea choices. China used to be like North Korea. Today, China is becoming like South Korea. The United States used to be like South Korea, but the United States now wants to become like North Korea, which is very strange, very paradoxical. It is true that the competition economic competition from China will be ferocious. But the one strategic mistake that the United States made was to believe so strongly in Ronald Reagan's statement, government is not the solution, government is the problem. Actually, when you deal with a formidable competitor like China, the government has to come in and help the industries where the workers lose their jobs and help them find new jobs. This is the answer.
So the book is Has China Won? The Chinese Challenge to American Primacy, which really couldn't have come at a better time, because there's so many Americans who I think kind of wrote off China as something to think about. It was too complex. It was too obscure or difficult to comprehend and not really relevant directly, but it's now taken center stage with this pandemic. And it's kind of inevitable and unavoidable that we need to grapple with this question. And this book, as you can undoubtedly see from this discussion, will help you do that. Thank you so much for taking the time. I found this discussion fascinating, like the book, and it's really helping me think through these issues. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I hope. Good night.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Joining me now to discuss the debate over the U.S.-China relationship and how Americans should think about China is somebody who has been at the center of some of the most compelling and one could say controversial debates. He's worked for a long time in various positions in Congress and in think tanks in Washington. He's currently a researcher with the American Economic Liberties Project and the author of a 2019 book that I've recommended many times entitled Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy, that considers a lot of the economic competition issues that has placed China and the United States at the center of these debates. Matt Stoller. Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to be able to discuss some of these things more in depth with you than online debates tend to permit. And I wanted to start with a very general question in that spirit, which is what I referenced in the introduction, which is I do think Americans are grappling more than ever before because of this pandemic with how to think about China. Probably a lot of people are thinking about China deeply for the first time because it seems necessary to do so now. And maybe the pandemic has altered how people think about China and the Chinese government as well. So I don't think it's a controversial statement to say that China is a competitor of the United States in terms of trade and economics and maybe even regional influence. I think to say that another country is a competitor is a pretty benign label. We probably would say that about most of our closest allies. The question that I think is crucial that shapes the entire debate is whether Americans ought to think about China as something more than just a competitor, as an adversary or even an enemy, maybe geopolitically, strategically, ideologically, militarily. How do you see that question? Is China an adversary or an enemy of the United States?
So I came to understand the problem of Chinese power by looking at monopolies domestically in the US. And what you notice really quickly is that there's been tremendous consolidation in the American corporate apparatus starting in the 1980s and getting much worse every year since. But what started to happen in the late 1990s, really after the 1995 creation of the World Trade Organization, and then supercharged when China became a permanent member in 2000. And this was the policy choice to create the WTO and to let China in permanently. Those were Clinton administration and Bush administration decisions. What you started to notice is that a lot of the consolidated corporate assets, aka the supply chains, the factories that made things that we need, started to move to China. And they moved really aggressively in force in the mid 2000s. So that's kind of how I came to see the problem of China in terms of risk. It's not just a geopolitical risk problem. It's also actually economic power over the United States and across the world, and then also just kind of productive capacity.
I guess to me, what you're describing seems more like policy choices that were made by U.S. industry and in conjunction with the U.S. government, as opposed to anything that China is doing that might be sinister or menacing or threatening. So if the concern is that the U.S. is overly dependent on one country for its supply chain, isn't the solution simply to either bring the jobs back to the U.S. or to diversify the number of countries in which the supply chain is placed?
Yeah, that is the solution. The reason I tell this story of how I got interested in China is because the politics are what make the problem sinister. And I'm not saying that just the Chinese government or the problem that we have, the main political problem now, is we have a relationship that goes back to the mid 1990s between autocrats on Wall Street and autocrats in the Chinese Communist Party. So a narrow group of people in both countries who have aligned for different reasons, and this is why the CCP is of deep concern to me. But they have aligned to move productive capacity and technology and know-how from the United States to China. And so to do what you're talking about, which is to diversify supply chains, to reshore some supply chains, what you would need to do is you would need to reduce the power of financiers, of middlemen in the United States, like fundamentally like people who work at McKinsey or who work at Goldman Sachs or who are in private equity. Those guys really want to devalue the producer, the worker, the person who makes things. And the easiest way to do that would be to just hand that whole job over to the Chinese Communist Party, who they don't care if they use slave labor, they don't care, whatever conditions they put their own population under. Their goal, and this is where the actual geopolitical problem comes up, their goal is to subvert the current international global order. And the current international global order is they perceive as a threat to their own kind of Leninist Marxist system. And I say that, and it sounds really weird and kind of dumb because it sounds like Cold War-ish, but they really are a Leninist Marxist party, and they are seeking to subvert liberal international norms like freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, which they see as kind of Western impositions, Western threats to the existence of the Chinese Communist Party. And it hasn't really been an issue until relatively recently, because the strategy of the CCP, and they're a lot of the people in that government are actually really good strategists and think long term in terms of planning. Also, the current international order is run sort of by morons, by greedy morons right now. So it's not too hard to defeat those norms. But one of the things that the CCP, the way that they think about power is they've had this strategy since the 80s where they kind of hide. I think the phrase was, hide your power, bide your time. And so they engage in substantial amounts of domestic repression, but they haven't really exported that repression because they understood that they were not politically, diplomatically, or economically, or technologically, or militarily powerful enough to sort of stand up to what they perceive as a United States-led oppressive imperialist order. But since the financial crisis of 2008, they've seen the sort of weakening of the West, and in this pandemic, they see an opportunity to actually really subvert that international order and sort of blunt what they perceive as an ideological threat from the West in the form of freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, those kinds of things. And so they are becoming more aggressive. You see them moving into Hong Kong and now just arresting all of the pro-democracy, even the moderates at this point. They've all been arrested. You've seen, the concentration camps of Uyghurs. Like, they're just much more aggressive. And then they really are starting a global censorship regime.
Let me interrupt
So
you
that's what's happening.
Right. So just on that, one of the premises that on which your answer rested is that the Chinese have become or are dissatisfied with the prevailing geopolitical order, see it as a threat. But if I'm looking at the world from the perspective of the Chinese government, I think I would be pretty content with the prevailing world order, because the United States spends trillions of dollars a year on this massive military and these multiple bombing campaigns and wars and military occupations that benefit the Chinese in all kinds of ways. The conditions over the last decade, as you've said, have enabled Chinese economic growth to boom, the Chinese population to experience prosperity that it previously couldn't even get close to. What is the evidence that, other than right in their immediate neighborhood, Hong Kong, Taiwan, the places that are really, of very direct historical, cultural, and geostrategic importance to China, that they're attempting in any way to alter the ideological world order or export their ideology to other countries? There is evidence that, like all powers, they try and use their strength, their economic strength in the case of China, sometimes their military strength, to prevent countries from taking positions that are contrary to their interests, from supporting the democracy movement in Hong Kong or recognizing Taiwan, like all countries do. But beyond that, those kind of normal things that big powers do, what evidence is there that China has the project similar to the Soviet Union, that it wants to really convert the entire world into its ideological vision?
So they say it, right? I mean, one of the problems with the U.S. framework is that we don't actually have that many people in government who speak Chinese. We don't translate a lot of their internal documents. And there's a lot more research going into this today. So it's kind of like the Chinese pay attention to the debate in the United States quite carefully. We do not pay close attention to the Chinese debate. It's also much more opaque. But let me just give you a couple of quotes. So this is a speech from Xi Jinping in 2017, where he laid out the main priorities for the Chinese state over the next 5 years. So he talked about how China is moving closer to the world stage, and argued that socialism with Chinese characteristics was blazing a new trail for other developing countries seeking to modernize and preserve their sovereignty. So blazing a new trail is the quote. This is a quote that that he said, I think, a couple of years before this, when he became the leader of China. Most importantly, we must concentrate our efforts on bettering our own affairs, continually broadening our comprehensive national power, improving the lives of our people, building a socialism that is superior to capitalism, and laying the foundation for a future where we will win the initiative and have the dominant position.
Right. So the Chinese want to increase their power in the world, increase their influence in the world in order to better their population. But do you view those votes as a declaration? And I guess, we can kind of debate what those words mean, but to me, they seem kind of like vague cliches or slogans about the importance of Chinese nationalism. But what if you were to kind of point to concrete steps that the Chinese government has taken to convince somebody, look, they intend to extend their influence using force or coercion, not just within China and within their immediate vicinity, but in other regions of the world, what would you point to? I mean, I could point, for example, if I wanted to convince somebody that the U.S. was doing that, to invasions, to bombing campaigns, to coups, to overthrows, to the use of international institutions like the OAS and the World Bank and the IMF, as evidence of how the U.S. tries to control the internal affairs of other countries and to mold it to serve its own interests. What is the evidence that China is doing that in a meaningful way?
Well, if you look at, you look at how they sort of the South China Sea, right, where they're building military bases and, $5 trillion of freight goes through the South China Sea. And they are being aggressive with all of their neighbors, claiming basically the whole area as theirs. And they were explicit. They said, we are not going to build military apparatus on the South China Sea. And then they started building artificial islands, saying there are no weapons there. We're not going to put weapons there. Over the last couple of years, they've obviously put a bunch of different weapons there. They are being, they are bullying Philippine fishing vessels. You see them trying to build a new internet global architecture. This is the Financial Times reported on this. Huawei is trying to replace the existing TCP/IP protocol or IP protocol with one which is much more authoritarian and where governments have a lot more capacity to engage in censorship. This is global. You see them exporting their surveillance systems to other countries and training them. You see it. You don't see now you see their navy is going into the Indian Ocean ostensibly to protect against piracy, but really to establish capacity in that ocean for military operations. You see them constantly threatening military action against Taiwan. You see them manipulating a whole bunch of multilateral institutions. Most recently, the World Health Organization. There's enough. And then you also see them engaging in retribution against other countries that mention the either concentration camps of Uyghurs or that ask about trying to figure out what happened with the Chinese cover up over the coronavirus.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I understand that point. So when a lot of people would listen to the Bill of Particulars that you just listed and believe, I think, with clear validity that those are all things the United States routinely does. And I suspect that's not something you would necessarily deny. Maybe you would say that the incarceration of Uyghurs in terms of the numbers and the conditions is something that the United States is beyond what the United States is currently doing in terms of human rights abuses, which one can debate. But in terms of what they're doing outside of their borders, to me at least, those things seem like things that great powers do in order to exert their influence in the world. And when you say that the Chinese view the current order as a threat to their project or their national interest, by that, do you mean that the Chinese want to undermine U.S. hegemony? And if that is what you mean, is that something that we as Americans ought to be concerned about? I mean, is U.S. hegemony something that serves the interest of the American people as opposed to specific power centers within the U.S.?
Yeah, that's a really important question because, part of the dynamic here is that the Chinese want to make this a question of US hegemony versus Chinese hegemony. And we don't really know what the Chinese global order would look like. We have sort of hints of it. Maybe they don't know. Maybe they're still arguing about it. But I'm not arguing for American hegemony. I think that it's problematic to make the case that America, has done has handled its global responsibilities particularly effectively, both in terms of the war in Iraq or various other what I think were just thuggish and stupid wastes of money and blood and deeply immoral. They don't actually care about that. They think that's actually good for them. Their problem is specifically freedom of thought, freedom of religion, the free press, the sort of parts of democracy that I think you and I value. And when I look at the global sort of order right now, I mean, I think you call it American-led, but it's not purely American-led. I mean, it's all over the world, all of Europe and all over East Asia. There are, this is an alliance. It's not just the U.S. doing all of this. I actually look at I actually go back to World War I, and what you see, and I think this is where there's a lot of the dispute between the left and sort of the realists in foreign policy comes down to whether you start from the Cold War, your history from the Cold War, or whether you start your history from the Treaty of Versailles. And a lot of the kind of the realists, right? And I don't put those people, I don't put that up as a sign of respect, just to sort of characterize that. And I think I'm probably more of a realist than anything else. But their view is that after World War I, America refused to actually guarantee security in Europe and in the Pacific. And so the result was, and that security is not just military, it's also economic, it's financial, it's diplomatic. When we actually just refused to provide that. And the result was another world war. And the people who negotiated the peace after that Second World War, many of them had been young and actually involved in negotiating the Treaty of Versailles. And they said, we're not going to do that again. We are going to make sure that there is some sort of global regime that ensures some sort of collective security. That was the original animus behind the United Nations, behind the World Bank, behind the GATT. And it was a kind of incomplete project. And when we talk about things like the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which was put together by a committee that was global and included an important Chinese diplomat, that was part of a global vision. And I think the Cold War, there was sort of, in the Western side, you saw some moves towards that. You definitely saw prosperity and political freedom in the Western Europe. I think you saw transition to democracy in certain parts of East Asia. You've seen, and then I think in America, you saw pressure on Jim Crow type of systems, but it was partial. And you also saw murderous behavior in Vietnam by the United States. You saw oppression and thuggery and murder across, in Indonesia and all over South America. It was a partial success and a partial failure, even up until and then in the 1990s, you saw a radical shift after the end of the Cold War, where America, and sort of led by Larry Summers and these neoliberals, said, now America is hyper dominant, and saw an even more, and I think, reckless and grossly irresponsible post-Cold War era. And now we're kind of paying the price where, Wall Street kind of took control. You still see some really beneficial things like the Obama, who I'm not, as you know, a fan of, but he did coordinate the sort of global response to Ebola. And that's one of the things you could see is, you could look at that and you could say, oh, that's just American imperialism. But you could also say, well, that's actually, a useful thing. At the same time, the bombing of Libya was really terrible and stupid and problematic. So what I'm trying to say is we have to shape a new global order. I think it's pretty obvious. And it's not, when I say we, I don't mean America. We're not strong enough to do it anymore. We have to do it in concert with others. What is that order going to look like? And there's a lot of people that are starting to think about that. And the Chinese challenge is prompting a lot of people to actually think about that. And, American instability is prompting a lot of people to think about that. Same with European instability. All I'm saying is that the goals of the CCP, from what we can discern, do not include things like, I'm going to keep saying it, but freedom of the press, freedom of thought, freedom of religion,
right.
individualistic autonomy.
Let me stop you there, because I really think this is the crux of the debate. I think it's the crux of the debate in terms of how people in the United States should most rationally think about the Chinese Communist Party. And it reminds me a lot of the debate after 9/11 about Islamic radicalism, where obviously radical Islamic groups in the Middle East didn't believe in things like Western conceptions of free speech or free exercise of religion, because they viewed it as being in conflict with their religious dogma about how their government should be ordered, how their society should be ordered. They were anathema to their vision of how they wanted their societies structured. But the debate was, did they really come to the United States and fly planes into buildings because they wanted to end those Western freedoms in the United States and in the West? Or were they doing it because they wanted to make certain that those values didn't contaminate their societies and wanted to put an end to U.S. interference in their region? In other words, what they really cared about was ending those freedoms, ending those political values, not globally. They don't care if the United States has free speech. What they wanted to make sure about is that their societies weren't molded and shaped in accordance with this vision that they didn't believe in. And that, to me, is the crux of the question about China. Obviously, the Chinese don't want Western conceptions of free press and free assembly and free speech in China, because they view it as bringing about disorder, an unraveling of the social fabric, which is anathema to the things that they most value. The question for me is whether they really care if the United States and Western Europe continues to adhere to those political visions, that political vision or those political values, or whether they really seek to impose this kind of, as a hegemonic power, the end of those values for everybody. Because if it's only the first, that suggests a much different way of looking at China than if they really do have this vision that a lot of neocons after 9/11, for example, claimed, I think invalidly, was the goal of Islamic radical groups, which was to impose Sharia law worldwide as opposed to simply within their society. On that distinction, where do you come down?
Yeah, so I think one of the big problems with the Western-led order right now is the lack of credibility on the part of American and Western policymakers, because, we lied, right? And we did a lot of really bad, terrible, stupid things in the Middle East. I think you could argue for many different reasons. Clearly, oil is a big part of it, but it was not, like what, the 9/11 was obvious blowback from American dominance in the region. You see stupid sort of battles with Iran right now. Like, it's just a lot of and this is the people that I talk to in Pentagon and national security world. They're not neocons. They're people who are saying, why are we wasting our blood and treasure in that region? Why are we doing that? That's immoral, and it's not strategic at all. I mean, I met a farmer from Pakistan who we flew him out when I worked in Congress. We flew him in, who had been subjected to a drone strike, his family, and I think one of his kids had died, and so did his mother. And he just talked to a bunch of congressional staffers and Congress people about what happened. And he was like, yeah, I was just a farmer, and it was with some drone, we don't know whose drone, but flew and just shot my family and blew up a couple of my family members. And, we asked him, do you hate the United States? And he was like, well, now I do. And it was like, it's pretty hard to object to that, right? I mean, that's obvious. He's obviously upset. And I think what you would find in any society that gets occupied or attacked because they want what's under your soil, a legitimate anger. And you can couch it in lots of ideological arguments about human rights or whatever. but there is a legitimacy there that I think
Okay, so let's apply that now to China. So because I think that's the issue is the posture of the Chinese, we don't want you creating unrest in Hong Kong. We don't want you interfering in our region with, by imposing your, American Western conception of freedom and democracy. We don't care what you do. You can have all the free speech and free press for your population that you want, have all the social disorder that you want, but don't bring it into our country or into our region. Is that their posture? Or is their posture what a lot of China hawks are claiming to make them scarier, which is no, they want to end it for everybody?
So first of all, to distinguish between the PRC, the Chinese Communist Party, and I'm not trying to use the word communist as a sort of demagoguery thing. I'm just trying to distinguish it because it's not the same as China, but we're using them interchangeably. They really they see. I think a lot of people in the Middle East see claims about America as a ruse for the blunt use of American power to get oil or for our own interests. The Chinese Communist Party sees arguments about human rights as a ruse for American and Western powers, very similar rhetorically to the people in the Middle East. But or at least governments in the Middle East and people in the Middle East in general. But what you don't see in China is you didn't see the invasions, the attacks. The Chinese have been enormous beneficiaries of the Western sort of led order. They have gotten much, much wealthier. That's what you're seeing. So it's fundamentally different because the PRC is not reacting to incursions into China. They're reacting to a situation in which they've benefited enormously from this Western kind of led economic order. And the strategy of policymakers for the Middle East was just sort of kick their ass and take their gas, right? That's the like crude way to put it. But the strategy for dealing with China, because it was Wall Street wanted to move a lot of capacity to China, McKinsey, they were making a lot of money there. Their strategy was what they called to bind China to a rules-based order, which is to say manage American decline by giving China more responsibilities. And then as America becomes less and less a part of the world GDP and China overtakes us, they will sort of become a liberal democracy, and the liberal democratic rules-based order, whatever you think about that, will continue under this sort of multilateral leadership in which China is a responsible stakeholder. That was the strategy. It was just a very different strategy than what we were doing in the Middle East. And the CCP, as it turns out, has agency, goals, and autonomy. And they were saying, sure, we'll take your technology, we'll take your know-how, we'll take all of this wealth. And they built a lot of it too. I'm not saying it was just, but they fundamentally rejected the idea of becoming of the liberal international order, and they said we will take all of this power, but we are going to ultimately reject and subvert this system.
But does the Chinese Communist Party care if countries in Western Europe and North America afford to their citizens free speech and free press rights, or is one of their goals to end that?
Yes, they do. They absolutely engage in retribution against Western companies, against governments, and this is the initial stages. This is China now becoming powerful, recognizing its own power, and deciding to go on the offensive. We don't know where it ends. My guess is that they're perfectly happy leaving some sphere of sovereignty and economic management to the West, but we don't know how broad that is. We don't know how narrow it is, and they are being aggressive. It's also not clear where this stops. And the Chinese Communist Party is weird because they are Marxist-Leninists, but they also have a strong ethno-nationalist base. So they've been buying up newspapers that serve Chinese diaspora communities, and they believe that if you are a Chinese citizen or if you're of Chinese ethnic descent, that you sort of belong to the Chinese government, and they will use coercive techniques to control you, as they do the diaspora abroad by many different through many different techniques. So, to the extent that maybe they just want to protect, even if you just acknowledge that they just want to protect themselves from criticism, China is a massive player in the world economy. It is a massive proportion of the world's population. And being unable to talk about your relationship with China when China is your number one global trading partner, which it is for, I think, over 100 countries at this point, that is a significant inhibition on being able to actually talk about an important area of your society. So even if you accept that that's the end, that's as far as they want to go, it's still a significant imposition of limitations on what other countries can actually talk about domestically.
Right, fair enough. So just the last question, which is, one of the characteristics of the debates of the war on terror was that whenever there would be some country that was being depicted as a threat, as China is now, there would be a lot of vague decrees that we have to be tougher towards this country, we have to punish them, we have to take action, without typically it being specified what those measures were that were being advocated. So oftentimes when people urge the West to view China as being a greater threat than they're currently seeing it as, it obviously provokes that question. Well, what do you want? Do you want a military confrontation with China? Do you want sanctions imposed on China by the West? Do you want to use international institutions to isolate China? What is it that you think the U.S. government, working with its allies, because as you said, it no longer has the strength to act unilaterally, ought to be doing to contain what you regard as this threat more than they're currently doing?
So the threat isn't just the CCP. The threat is this alliance between Wall Street and economic elites all over the world and the CCP, right? That's what makes this fundamentally different than the neocon framework. Like the neocon framework is America's hyper-dominant, let the economy produce whatever it produces, bombs and whatnot, and then we'll just use our military power to, bomb whoever we want and structure the world however we want. My view, and I think the view of a lot of the people that are looking at China, not the neocon sort of hawkishness, although I don't think the neocons are really that outspoken yet on China, although they're moving that direction. The way to address China is we have to deal with the domestic institutions that subvert our own liberties and are willing to sell off our own sovereignty to China. So it's more of an economic and political problem than it is actually a military problem. There's no way in which a military confrontation with China results in anything good. It's just never gonna. It's just a bad idea. I think the basic way to address the problem is to decouple our economy from China, to get rid of our dependencies on Chinese supply chains and move production back to the US, move production to democracies, and actually just kind of try as best as possible to get rid of the integrated globalized world order, work with China where we need to on things like climate change or managing oceans or other common collective problems. But other than that, try to pull back and try to create some level of self-sufficiency among democracies and protect the values that I think we care about. But I would say it's not just about protecting those values. I think it's also about kind of relearning those values. I think, the Chinese, the sort of ideological argument by the CCP is aided by the rise of autocratic sensibilities in the United States and across Western Europe. And I'm not just talking about Trump. I'm not really even talking about Trump. There was an article in The Atlantic by a Harvard law professor named Jack Goldsmith, who talked about how, the American version of an open internet and the Chinese version of a controlled internet were kind of in ideological conflict, and the Chinese were correct. We need censorship. We need control because the internet chaotically is not a safe space. That's actually the concern that I have. And I think that the Chinese are presenting a coherent and capable and strong and strategic ideological counterpoint to what we have right now in the West, which is kind of like We're kind of corporatist. We're like in the 1920s again. We got one foot in liberal democracy. We have elections, we have newspapers, we have the ornamentation of democratic systems, but we're also very, very controlled by elite corporatist structures, private equity, monopolists, and we could go either way. And I think the most important thing to do is to actually go towards liberal democracy, prove to ourselves, prove to the rest of the world that it can deliver a better system. And then we can, and as we do that, we can build out a global order that is contingent upon democratic norms. But we have to believe in that ourselves. And right now, that's the main challenge. And I think the problem there is definitely the PRC's alliance with Wall Street. But it is Wall Street. It is our current political elites that don't quite believe in liberal democracy. So that's the main challenge I think we have, is we have to restore the idea of liberal democracy and make it work.
Yeah, I'm actually glad that we ended up in essentially the place where we kind of began, which is the question of whether China is this kind of traditional adversary of the U.S. the way, say, Iraq in 2003 was, or the Soviet Union during the Cold War was, or other countries, Iran, that get demonized and villainized as the threat which the United States has to unite in order to confront. Because typically in those cases, all of the power centers in the U.S. are on board with treating those other countries as the adversary and benefit from it. Whereas in China, it's a much more mixed case, because the reality is that the government in China is in bed with probably the most powerful power centers in the United States, even though there's a Tom Cotton or a Marco Rubio or some like unhinged generals talking about China as the enemy in some Cold War sense. And that's why I do think this left-wing critique that says, oh, you can't criticize China or talk about China because you're going to fuel warmongering, which might be the case if you talk about Saddam Hussein or the Iranian mullahs' human rights abuses, is really kind of misguided. Because in this case, what's happening with China is an alliance with U.S. power centers, not an animosity that is affecting not just the global order, but workers in the United States, the ability to maintain decent livable wages and the like. And that also means that when we think about how we might want to change some of these problems, it doesn't mean military confrontation with China or even diplomatic and, sanctions regimes kind of confrontations. It could just mean domestic policy changes of protectionism, of bringing jobs back, of punishing corporations that offshore jobs. And I think that really makes China kind of a unique case in terms of thinking about how we should view it with respect in comparison to how we thought about other U.S. adversaries in the past.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be, it's so interesting to learn about China, and I apologize because I'm not super fluent in this problem. I'm still trying to think it through, but ultimately we have to show that the values that we believe in, or at least the values that we say we believe in, are in fact the values that we believe in. And that those values, when we instrumentalize them in governing institutions, can actually serve the public and can be a better system to live under than alternative authoritarian systems. And right now, we haven't made that case.
Look, why don't we end it here? Because I think that one of the reasons why I want to talk to you is I actually trust more people who are grappling with how to think about China than I do trust people who have extremely fixed and kind of dogmatic perspectives on it, because I really don't think it lends itself to those kinds of pat answers because of the complexities of the relationship.
I just want to make one other point,
Sure.
Is that, one of the things that was really inspiring to see during when the pandemic happened in China is there was that doctor, Dr. Li, who actually was warning other doctors about it. And then the Chinese police said, no, you can't do that. And then he got coronavirus and died. And he became a hero in China. And he was a hero, and people said, we want free speech. We don't think that the government should repress our ability to speak. And what you're seeing, this debate is not just happening in the US, it's not just happening all over the world, it's also happening in China. And I think that's important to understand, even though we don't see it because there's a lot of repression. It is not a unified country, and people do not agree on the values that they want to organize their society around, or the world in China either. So this debate it's not just us who are the agents here.
Right. All right, Matt. Well, this has been as interesting and as in depth as I was hoping it would be, and I know that you've received a lot of criticism for your views, but I think it's an incredibly important debate for the American left to have. You can't say that you care about the American worker or about wages or about job loss in the industrial Midwest or anywhere else in the West and not think about the role that China is playing, even though it can subject you to a lot of criticism. So I really appreciate the role that you played in kind of stimulating this debate and in helping me think through these issues as well. Thanks so much.
Hey, thanks a lot.
All right, Matt.
Thanks.